Everybody. Great to see so many people joining us this morning and quite a few new faces, people that I haven't necessarily met before. And thanks to Daryl and Finn for taking the time out this morning to contribute as well. Really appreciate that. I'll keep it short and sweet. Just a little bit of a kind of overview, I suppose, on what we're seeing in the local market that might be of interest. Significant temp demand as many businesses look to kind of use temporary workers to get product out the door. A lot of pent-up demand still from last year, as well as maybe a few nerves around people not necessarily wanting to commit to permanent people as well. But we are seeing strong perm demand as well. But really interestingly there, still real tight candidate availability, both locally and nationally. There is still a skill shortage in the UK. And what's very real is that there is a mismatch between maybe the people that are coming onto the market and where the demand sits within the market, particularly in kind of specialist areas such as IT and engineering. I think one of the reasons that Hewett continue to do the forums with the Chamber is that we see this opportunity for HR professionals to get together as something that's really, really important, and never more so than at the moment. I think every business, regardless of your role, we've all kind of spent the last 12 months dealing with the kind of 6 inches that is in front of our face, whether it be the fallout of COVID, getting prepared for Brexit, or as prepared as we could be, and various other things that have cropped up over the last 12 months. And so the ability to kind of step back and share some thoughts and ideas with your kind of peers and maybe start thinking more about that medium to long term again is really important, because, you know, some of those long term priorities, like the skills agenda, for example, they haven't gone away. And we need to make sure they still kind of stay, you know, in our mind's eye. So I won't speak any longer. I really appreciate all of you taking the time out to join us this morning, and I hope you get something out of it, and look forward to seeing you at future events and moving forwards. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Thanks for the update. If anyone does have any questions for Ben, please pop them in the chat, and he'll be prepared to answer them that way. Fab. On to our first speaker then. So I would like to introduce Daryl Thomas, who is a partner at MFG Solicitors, and he will be sharing his screen with us shortly, hopefully.
Let's see how this works then. It worked fine just now, so. Yeah, that's all good, yeah.
Yeah, if you just start from the beginning.
Yeah, okay. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I thought today would be useful for people if we were to look at a basic sort of redundancy overview.
Daryl, sorry to interrupt you. If you just press start from the beginning so we can see the whole PowerPoint. Yeah, press that button.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then use the arrows. Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. So yeah, I thought I'd go through a redundancy process for 2 reasons. One, there's not very much happening at the minute. There's no real cases going through the tribunals. There's nothing particularly interesting and exciting to tell anyone anything about. And secondly, based on our experience in September and October last year, and the fact that the furlough scheme is almost certain to end at the end of April this year, it's extremely likely that, again, there will be a huge flurry of redundancy activity. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is a bit of an introduction and a background, a quick description of what is a redundancy. Then I'm going to go through the planning stage, which is probably the most important aspect of anything like this. Then I'm going to talk to you about carrying out a small scale redundancy. And then I'm going to touch upon large scale redundancies in not so much detail, simply because they're not that common. Unless you've got a workforce of 400 or 500, they're unlikely to happen. And most of the people who would come on this forum today would probably not be involved in that scale of redundancy. So in terms of introduction and background, I've heard an economist say that the current furlough scheme is simply anaesthetising the jobs market to the economic reality of the situation it faces. So even though there are not as many people now on furlough leave as there was probably last April, May, June, there are still a significant number of people on furlough. And the scheme has been made more flexible in that, you know, people can be on it part-time as opposed to all or nothing. But I think it seems quite certain that that scheme will end on the 30th of April, and we'll be left on our own thereafter that. And many of you will be forced into making redundancies. And now is the time, I guess, you may be starting to think about how things are going to look in a couple of months' time. So yeah, based on what we experienced in September and October, when the initial furlough scheme was due to end, we do anticipate, as a department, being extremely busy with redundancy-related matters from probably mid to late March. There is a significant difference this time around with the scheme in that last time, employers could claim back for notice periods within the furlough scheme. So people were almost incentivized to get it done and dusted early before the scheme, which was due to end on the 31st of October, was going to end. So there was quite a big flurry, in fact, of activity in August with people planning, because if they had people on 10, 12 weeks notice, they wanted to make sure things were done and dusted by, you know, by that late October point, so they got as much out the scheme as possible. This time around, there's less of an incentive for that because you cannot claim for the notice period anymore. So, you know, there's no incentive to get it done and dusted well in advance. So we anticipate a slightly later oncoming of activity than what we saw in the autumn, but it'll come mid-March onwards. Of course, the last scheme acting and ending like it did cause significant difficulty then, because when they extended it for a further 7 months, many employers had already carried out their redundancies at the point in time they'd announced it, which was, I think, early November. So it did cause a degree of difficulty because people had been let go of and paid redundancy pay who they might have wanted to keep hold of for 8 months. And whilst they allowed you to re-employ these people, once sometimes that goodwill and good faith is gone, it's very difficult to do that. So redundancy is defined by Section 139 of the Employment Rights Act. As for the purposes of this Act, an employee who is dismissed shall be taken to be dismissed by reason of redundancy if the dismissal is wholly or mainly attributable to A, the fact that his employer has ceased or intends to cease to carry on the business for the purpose of which the employee was employed by him, or to carry on that business in the place where the employee was so employed, or B, the fact that the requirements of that business for employees to carry out work of a particular kind, or for employees to carry out work of a particular kind in the place where the employee was employed, have ceased or diminished or are expected to. So what, in essence, does that mean in real terms? So redundancy is a potentially fair reason for dismissal, up there with misconduct, capability, some other substantial reason, and a few other things. And in basic terms, it means that if your business is closing, or your workplace is closing, or there is a reduced requirement for employees doing what you do, which is the most common one that we see, is that an employer decides they don't need 10 people doing something, they need 8. So this can take several forms. The removal of the role from your organisation, which is a much more straightforward scenario if it's a standalone function, because it eliminates the need for the whole selection and pool and grouping and all that business, which is where most tribunal claims come from. So the other option is where there are a grouping of employees doing the same role, a more economical process may be identified, leading to the requirement for less employees to conduct that role. And that's where you see the problems with unfair dismissal claims and appeals and all sorts. Or where it's identified that a particular role no longer needs to be undertaken at such a senior level and can be undertaken far more cost effectively by a more junior employee. So the definition of work of a particular kind encompasses work being undertaken at a particular level. So if you've got someone on £80,000 a year doing a role, and you realise that the next grade down can quite effectively do that role on 60 grand a year, then it's a significant saving to re-employ someone on the more junior role. And that falls within work of a particular kind, i.e. work of such a level of seniority that it doesn't need to be done at that level. So one of the most common misconceptions when we have calls from individuals who've been made redundant or facing selection, one of the most common points that's put to us is that they can't be redundant as their duties still need to be undertaken. So their functionality still exists as such. And that's probably one of the most common misconceptions with a redundancy, because 99% of the time, the actual tasks that an individual were performing do still need to be performed and do still exist. They have just been re-assimilated into other roles or scaled down, some parts outsourced. So whilst on the face of it, it appears that those tasks need doing, it just means they don't need a dedicated person to carry out those tasks. So moving on to the planning stage of redundancy, which is probably the most important stage, because if you haven't got your plan in place before you start off, particularly if you've got multiple people involved as opposed to a standalone redundancy situation, then you're going to be backpedaling all the way through it. And that's where you start having difficulties. So do not commence a redundancy process without thoroughly thinking through all of the stages. Because once those who have been identified at being at risk of redundancy have been engaged, they will expect you to know everything. They will expect you to be able to give them all the answers. They will hit you with all their questions. So you need to know how this is going to work. You can't be muddling through it and pulling different people in at different stages. So the first thing you need to do is to establish your business case for redundancy, which is why you need to do it. And it doesn't mean to say that you as a business are struggling and you have to find savings, which again is something that people put forward to us. They often say, well, the business isn't struggling, it's making profit, et cetera, et cetera. It's not relevant whether you need to do it to save the company. You can make redundancies because you've identified that somewhere else you can save £20,000 in making that redundancy, even if all you're doing is topping up your profit levels. Your duty as a business owner is, and the whole purpose within the Companies Act and Partnerships Act of a business or a partnership is to make profit. So, you don't need to be doing it to save the company. But you do need to know your business case. And ultimately, an employment tribunal doesn't have any jurisdiction to interfere with a business decision. So if you can demonstrate that you've made a decision for the business, that redundancy is in the best interest of the business, then a tribunal can look no further into that. So it's the end of that argument. You then need to consider who will be affected by that business decision. So will it be a standalone role, or will a selection pool need to be formed? And then in turn, if a selection pool is going to be formed, how will they be pooled? How will that be structured? And then how are you going to then decide from those pools who will be made redundant? The most common method is to establish a scoring matrix, which is actually quite an unduly complicated task, because you have to look at your business and decide what your business needs and score people on the right things for your business. There's no almost pro forma that will do the job exactly. There are various pro formas that will do much of the job, but you need to ensure that at the end of this process, you have the right people left in your business and have not got rid of them because your scoring matrix has been geared the wrong way. So you need to consider what your criteria will be and how it will be weighted. So if there's a particular point that's more important to your business, then you can attribute higher marks to that aspect than something that's less important to your business. You need to then know, as I say, who will undertake that task, and it is worth engaging more than one person to do so. So the way we recommend a scoring process is undertaken is that you at least have two people doing it. They go off and score people independently of each other. they then get together with their scores and discuss them and average out their scores. The simple reason for that is that it reduces any argument from an employee that, you know, they've been the victim of a subjective opinion that's unfair. You need to try and keep the process as open and objective as possible, as opposed to it being one man or woman's subjective viewpoint. So it almost acts as they act as a balancer to each other doing it that way. You may have to provide a degree of training to people who are going to be involved in the process. So you need to know, almost have a map at the start of which people in your organization are going to undertake each stage of the process, from the initial telling people they're at risk of redundancy to the pooling, the scoring, the consultation meetings, and the appeal. And you need to have the right person at the end, at the appeal, who's more senior than everyone else. So you can't really make this stuff up as you go along, or you will end up in a bit of a mess. So it is absolutely imperative that you plan this from the beginning and roadmap it out completely. It's also worth knowing who will cost what if they are selected for redundancy. If you've got someone who's been employed with you for 20 years, who's 60 years old, they're going to cost a lot more to make redundant than someone who's been with you for 10 years, who's 35 years old. So, you know, if part of your rationale is to save costs and you know, make money, then you need to look at that aspect, because if you're suddenly then landed with a redundancy bill at the end that is quite significant, it may cause more problems than it solves. You might want to consider those in the relevant pools with less than 2 years service, because they have no rights generally to bring a claim for unfair dismissal. They have no entitlement to redundancy pay. So there's far less scope for those people to cause you problems. You don't need to make them redundant, because as a matter of law, they haven't got the service to be made redundant. So moving on then to small scale redundancy processes, which by small scale, I mean less than 20 people being made redundant over a 90-day period in one establishment, which is what the vast majority of redundancy situations, you know, we advise on, and most people we come across face. So despite your earlier planning, when you enter this stage of the process, it is essential that you do it with an open mind, because consultation has to be undertaken on a completely open basis. You can't enter it with a very clear mindset of who's going to be made redundant, how this is going to sort of go A, B, C, D, that it's just going to go exactly as you planned, because people may raise things that slow the process down, that need further consideration, that, you know, make you question what you're doing. So you do have to enter it open-mindedly. So the first stage is to place all those employees that may be affected at risk of redundancy. So this is an informal stage. So you don't need to give them, you know, 2 or 3 days notice of coming to the meeting or allow them to be accompanied. You are simply informing them by way of a phone call, a group meeting, and a basic letter to back it up, that unfortunately they have been placed at risk of redundancy at this stage, and that they will be shortly receiving correspondence inviting them to a first stage consultation meeting, and all their questions will be answered at that stage. Normally you can ask a line manager, someone local to them, to undertake that part of the process, and they should then ideally not be involved further down the line, because that can raise questions. They don't need to answer questions. They simply need to tell people that their questions will be dealt with at the consultation meeting. So I've dealt with that. So moving on from that, then we enter what is essentially the formal stage of the process. And the employee should be invited to the initial consultation meeting in a formal manner, providing at least 48 hours notice and advised of the right to be accompanied. So the purpose of this initial meeting with the employee is to explain to them why this is happening. Why are you doing this? What's all this about? to answer any questions they've got at that stage, to explain to them, on the assumption it's not a standalone situation, to explain to them how they're going to be pooled, how they're going to be, or what the proposed selection criteria is, because all of these things are subject to consultation. So whilst you've got your selection criteria, you have to put it to the employees before you score it. Employees should then be given a date to come back to you with any questions, any ideas, any concerns before the next stage 2 consultation meeting. They should be informed that they are now entering a formal period of consultation, and they should be invited to consider all aspects and encouraged to set out these comments, ideally by email or wherever, so there's a record of it. They should be told that consultation is a two-way process and you welcome their full engagement. We often have arguments from employees or claimants at this point saying, well, they didn't engage in the process because they didn't think it was worth it, and it was, the employer made it very clear it was a done deal. The simple fact is, if as an employee you don't put forward your points, your concerns, then an employer can't consider them, and then you can't use it, or it can't be used against you as an employer further down the line when you've not suddenly looked at their wonderful ideas, because it's too late to tell you when they're taking you to tribunal. They should be invited to a further consultation meeting, perhaps 7 days away, asking them to submit any further comments within 5 days, and that includes any thoughts on the scoring process and the structure and everything else. If after those 5 days you've not heard anything else, then you should engage in the scoring of those employees, ready to inform them at the next meeting what the outcome or provisional outcome is. So the next meeting, again, they should be invited formally at every point. The purpose of that meeting is to then present the employees with their provisional scores. And this is, again, on the assumption that some, huge amounts of things haven't been thrown at you in the initial 5 days. If all your employees have come back arguing with you about the criteria and everything else, you may need to delay it a bit longer to at least look into what they're saying. But you should inform them of their provisional scores. And then likewise, those SAFE should be informed of this, albeit as a provisional outcome. It suddenly makes a mockery of the process. If you tell everyone that scored above the threshold that that's it, the situation's done, it kind of makes it very difficult to then undertake any further discussions with any credibility, because you can't then go back to those people if you've had to rescore things and tell them that they're now not safe. The individual scoring is then subject to consultation at this stage and is not final. So after that initial meeting, they should be sent away and given a few days to come back to you with any comments on before the third meeting. Because again, if they raise a number of issues, they need to be dealt with before matters can be finalised. This is what the consultation is all about. The employee then needs to be invited to a final meeting, which is subject to any further discussion surrounding the scoring, will be the final outcome meeting. So remember to inform the employee then that a possible outcome of that meeting may be that their employment is terminated. The employee is likely then to appeal. You should ensure that they clearly set out the basis of their appeal, as opposed to, I want to appeal because I don't agree with the decision. That's not going to get anyone anywhere. So it's imperative to put it on them to explain why they don't agree. And most commonly, the disagreement is because of the scores they've received. But it's worth remembering that an employment tribunal does not have jurisdiction to undertake a rescoring process. So if someone comes to you and says, well, I should have had a 6 for this and you've given me 5, and I should have had a 4 for this and you've given me 3, and so on, a tribunal can't engage at that level. If someone is saying, I should have had a 10 for this, looking at your criteria, and you've given me a 2, and that's a theme throughout, then a tribunal can look at that because it's manifestly wrong. But if it's quibbling over 1 or 2 points here and there, a tribunal cannot get involved. So just quickly, finally, moving on to large-scale redundancies. These only apply when either you're making 20 to 99 employees over a 90-day period at a single site redundant. That requires a 30-day statutory consultation. Where it's 100 or more in 90 days, then a 40-day consultation period is required. You have to also inform the Redundancy Payments Office on the HR1 form within those relevant 30 or 45 minutes of 45 days of the first dismissal that you are intending on making such numbers of redundant. Prior to commencing the process, you must undertake the nomination and election of employee representatives for collective consultation to take place. This can take 5 to 7 days in itself, so you need to plan in that part of the process. At the conclusion of the collective consultation period, you should then still hold one final individual consultation meeting with all employees to ensure that, you know, the reps have done their job properly and everything has been answered and communicated effectively. You cannot confirm an outcome until that relevant 30 or 45-day period has ended. And so you cannot have notice running simultaneously with it. And also it's worth complying with these rules, because otherwise an employee can make a claim for a protective award if you do not, as well as unfair dismissal. And the maximum award is 90 days gross pay per employee. The starting point for an employment tribunal is to award 90 days pay, and you have to demonstrate very good reason for it not to be that much. So generally, if you get clobbered for one of these awards, it will be 90 days if you fail to do what you should have done. So that can get quite expensive if you've got 30 employees claiming that. And that's it. If anyone's, I don't know if any questions have been submitted.
Great, thank you, Daryl. We have got one question. If anyone does have any other questions, please put them in the group chat now. So first question is from Claire. Do you recommend sharing the scoring matrix with the individuals and ask them to score themselves, then having a meeting to agree the scores?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking sort of more in-depth HR practice there. And, you know, as I said to get 2 employees to formally score it, but I can see the benefit as well in asking the employee to score themselves, and just to get an idea of where they think they should be. Now, I think such a score would have to be read with a pinch of salt, because it's going to be entirely subjective. It's going to be entirely self-serving. You know, often when we deal with performance management processes, employees are quite, well, strong in their belief that they do a great job for their employer. And it's difficult to persuade employees that it's not their decision as to whether they do a great job, it's the employer's. So I think you'd have to read such an exercise with a pinch of salt, but, you know, you should definitely share the matrix with them, because that's part of consultation, so they know how they're being scored and, you know, where you're coming from with that. But, and if you want to ask them to do that, then that's fine, but it shouldn't become a fundamental part of the process, because I think you'll end up with very high scores from every employee.
Okay, great, thank you. Oh, we have had another question actually, Daryl. Would you like to talk to us through terminating contracts and offering terms which are less favourable, as it's a way of making redundancies?
That's slightly different side of things. Often, I mean, I'm not sure whether you mean restructuring and asking everyone to reapply for their jobs, or whether you're trying to go through an exercise of changing terms and conditions of employment. It is obviously a fairly risky process. If you are trying to engage with your workforce to change on block certain terms and conditions of employment, then you have to follow a process to vary that contract. And ultimately, one of the tools available to an employer is, if they are unable to reach agreement with every employee, and quite often there is always one or two who sort of stick in there, then you are entitled essentially to terminate their employment under the sort of heading of some of the substantial reason, which is a catch-all provision to fairly dismiss them. And yeah, you can then re-offer them to be employed on the terms you want to employ them on. And they have a choice then. They either take those terms or they are out of a job. So it is an effective tool, but it can be a bit risky, particularly on a more mass sort of scale. It's better if you can reach agreement with employees, because ultimately then that employee that's coming back in who's been forced to change their terms without wanting to, isn't probably going to be a very productive or helpful employee either.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daryl. Terry, I hope that answers your question. If anyone does have any more questions, we can come back to them at the end of the event. But thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, Daryl. I did forget to mention at the start, actually, I will be following up with an email with both presentations on today, so you'll have that for reference too. So thanks, Daryl. I'd now like to hand over to Finn. Finn, hopefully you'll be sharing your screen with us soon.
Yep.
Lovely.
Can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
So, I guess I'll start then. So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you to Yasmin for inviting me to talk to you all today. So I'm Finn, I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Managing Director of Rose Diversity Training. So we provide expert consultancy, training and business guidance for companies in the UK to help them meet their diversity goals with a specific emphasis on LGBT inclusion. So today I'm going to talk to you about one small way that you can help promote inclusion in your workplaces. But to begin, I want to just introduce you to the concept of hidden issues in diversity work. So diversity and inclusion training in the UK tends to be led by the 2010 Equality Act, which lists 9 protected characteristics, which you can see on the screen now. If you think about diversity training that you've received in the past, certainly I know that I've received, it tends to focus on just 1 or 2 of these protected characteristics. So maybe race, maybe women's workplace equality, maybe disability if it was a bit more in depth. But the reality is that a day-long session just doesn't have the time to get into the depth and nuances of each protected characteristic. So diversity training historically tends to focus on either 1 or 2 of the really hot button topics such as race, or just skim over each characteristic to take a wider view of the law. So there's a few issues with that approach to diversity training. And one of the big ones is that certain protected characteristics can get glossed over because they might be perceived to be less important, they might be perceived to be less relevant, or they might be outside of the expertise of the person doing the training. Having said that, I'm willing to bet that very few of you, if any, have been given specific diversity training as it relates to this characteristic, gender reassignment. So gender reassignment here refers to transgender people. We don't use the term gender reassignment in the community for a few reasons, but mostly because it emphasizes the medical aspect of transitioning, which is something that not every trans person goes through. In fact, the term gender reassignment is considered quite offensive. In fact, the Women and Equalities Commission has called on the government to actually update this legislation and replace gender reassignment with transgender status. So transgender is an umbrella term that we use for someone whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. This includes trans men, trans women, and those that don't align with a particular gender who might refer to themselves as gender non-conforming, non-binary, gender fluid, or agender. There's no one way to be transgender, and not all transgender people undergo medical interventions. In the workplace, trans people are protected from discrimination by the Equality Act 2010 and the Data Protection Act 2018, also known as GDPR. That said, because most employers do not train their staff adequately about trans issues, employees and customers can still face discrimination issues. Even though discrimination against trans people is illegal, various factors combine to mean that the majority of discrimination actually goes unreported, meaning that employers often don't invest enough time, money, or effort in ensuring that their workplaces are inclusive of trans people. For example, a few years ago, I was involved in a discrimination incident with a major bank. So basically, I was changing my name on my bank account, and the clerk hadn't been trained properly. So she didn't know the process for dealing with the request. She basically passed my documents around to her colleagues. They laughed at me. They literally called me slurs and stuff in front of other customers. And they then just kind of sent me away saying they didn't know how to process my request. I was obviously humiliated by this. I was angry, but they'd also put me at risk because the bank was located in a place where I had previously been physically assaulted. So if this member of staff had received proper training and access to inclusive policies, she might not have been so dismissive, and the bank wouldn't have had to pay me the £150 compensation they ended up giving me. Now, you might think that your business doesn't need this because you don't have any trans staff or customers. But being transgender isn't like being gay. So according to a 2018 Stonewall report, around 96% of lesbian, gay and bisexual people are out at work. For trans people, only 63% are out at work. And the vast majority of these people are only open with their identity because it's impossible to hide. For people who have fully transitioned, you would never know unless explicitly told. In fact, when I think about the kind of retail jobs that I've had in the past, I wasn't out at work either. Furthermore, we don't have any reliable data about how many trans people live in the UK. So estimates suggest around 1% of the overall population, but the actual figure is likely to be much higher than that. So with the remainder of this talk, I want to talk to you about one small thing that you can do to help promote trans inclusion in your business, and that is thinking about language. So first, let's look at pronouns. So a pronoun is a word that substitutes for a noun, such as him or her. Don't worry, this isn't going to be a grammar lesson. So every day when we talk about other people, we unconsciously gender them with the language that we use. If someone looks like a man, you'll call them he, and if someone looks like a woman, you'd call them she. When we do this, we're making an assumption about the identity of the person. So most of the time, this assumption will be correct, but occasionally it won't be. And everyone can imagine the offense you might cause by accidentally calling a woman him or a man her. Pronouns are really important, and it's important that we use the right ones because they speak to the identity of the individual that we're talking about. So pronouns replace someone's name, and just as we wouldn't guess someone's name, we shouldn't guess their pronouns either. It has actually been argued that the ability to have your pronouns guessed correctly is a form of privilege because not everyone has this luxury. So as a trans man, before I had the ability to start taking testosterone, I would constantly be misgendered by people calling me she. And for people whose gender identity is different from the gender they were assigned at birth, making sure your pronouns are guessed correctly is a daily struggle, especially if you don't have the means to or simply don't want medical intervention. And for those outside of the traditional gender binary of male or female, there are even more issues. So if you exist outside of male or female, for instance, if you are non-binary, gender fluid, or agender, for example, you might not feel comfortable using he or she, and will constantly have to correct these assumptions about your gender. So I want to play a little game. I'm going to show you some images, and I want you to think about the pronouns that you would use to address these people. You can either put them in the chat or just shout them out loud to yourself, or just do it in your head, whichever is fine. So what pronouns would you use to address this person if you saw them just in the street? I'm just going to give a few seconds because we need to move on. So, yeah, this person uses he, him pronouns. What about this person? If you guess she, her, then you would be correct. What about this person? I'm willing to bet a lot of you would assume she, her. But this is actually Ruby Rose, and they are non-binary, and they use they, them pronouns. What about this person? So you might assume he, him. This is actually Sam Smith, and you might have seen that they recently came out as non-binary, and they use they, them pronouns. And what about this person? So you might assume she, her. This is actually Elliot Page. Formerly Ellen Page. He recently came out as a transgender man, and he uses he, him pronouns. So I hope that illustrates that using pronouns is really important in our society, but guesswork can be unreliable and has the potential to cause distress and even play into incidents of discrimination. So how can we remedy this? Well, we can state our pronouns. In the same way that you would state your name, you should state your pronouns too. This approach has a few benefits. So firstly, by being upfront with your pronouns, you're ensuring that you will be gendered correctly. And it also encourages others to state their pronouns too. Additionally, acknowledging pronouns indicates to any trans and gender non-conforming people, both in and out of the closet, that this is a safe space for them to explore and present their true gender expression and identity. Now, obviously, you don't have to do this like every time you state your name. You don't want to necessarily respond to your Starbucks barista once we finally get over COVID with your name and pronouns when you're ordering a flat white. But it is helpful in formal contexts such as business meetings and networking opportunities. Other places where displaying your pronouns is a good idea include your email signature and professional social media accounts. So there's an increasing move towards companies asking their employees to include their pronouns alongside their name on email and social media, as it indicates that a business is inclusive of all identities. Sometimes I'm asked whether it's discriminatory to use the wrong pronouns for someone. My answer would be that it depends on the intention. So if you simply make a mistake or slip up, that's not discrimination. Just apologize and move on as if you forgot someone's name. However, if you refuse to use the pronouns that someone tells you to, or you deliberately use pronouns that they don't identify with, then that could be discrimination. For instance, if you refuse to call a trans woman she and refer to them as he consistently, then that could be grounds for discrimination under the definition of harassment. Another question I'm asked is, will people think I'm trans if I display my pronouns publicly? The answer to this is no. In fact, if you do a search on LinkedIn or Twitter, you'll see a vast range of different people with pronouns in their name or bio, and the majority of them aren't trans. Everyone has a gender identity and pronouns that we'd like to be referred to by, and that isn't limited to trans people. So the second thing we can do in our businesses is use gender neutral language. If you don't know someone's gender, don't assume. You don't have to. In English, the gender neutral pronoun they is fine for situations where you're referring to someone whose gender you don't know. Some trans and gender non-conforming people specifically use they instead of a gendered pronoun, as it more comfortably represents their identity outside of the gender binary, as we've seen in the examples. And using they as a pronoun isn't restricted to trans and gender non-conforming people either. Sometimes people's names aren't clearly gendered, and therefore their gender identity might not be obvious. For example, if you're talking to someone on the phone, their voice might not align with what you might expect based on assumptions you made based on their name. So instead of risking insulting them, just use gender neutral language instead. It isn't grammatically incorrect to use they to refer to a single person. The Oxford English Dictionary actually lists this as a correct usage, and Austen, Shakespeare, and Chaucer all use they in their work. So thinking about gender neutral language, you might want to look at your company policies with this in mind. A lot of the time we use gendered language when there's simply no need to. For instance, instead of writing in your company policies, he or she should do X, just write the employee should do X. Or instead of saying men and women, just say people. We also do this when we introduce ourselves a lot too. So how many times have you said, hi guys, or ladies and gentlemen, when you're introducing yourself to a group of people? Instead, you could just say, hi folks, or hi everyone instead. I know it seems small, but the ladies and gentlemen thing really used to bug me a lot when I was kind of pre-transition. So I'm aware that these fixes might seem really insubstantial, right? Or that the problem itself just seems small. If anything, take that as an indication that with just minimal effort, we can do a lot more to support the trans community, both in the workplace and as customers, but also in society in general. So to finish, I often tell people that if gay liberation exists in 2021, right, then trans liberation is stuck in 1981. Particularly in the UK at the moment, there is an extremely toxic debate happening right now about whether trans people deserve to exist openly in public spaces and enjoy self-determination. In fact, there's actually legislation that the government are looking at right now to block trans people's access to bathrooms. So don't know where that's going, but it doesn't look good. Being trans in the UK right now is really hard, and we need allies more than ever. So by doing these two small things, displaying your pronouns and increasing your use of gender neutral language, you're making the UK a more welcoming place for the trans community. If you find this interesting, I actually uploaded a video on our YouTube channel yesterday, all about pronouns. It looks at this in more depth. It looks at gender neutral language in more depth. And we also look at neo-pronouns, which I haven't had time to get into today. So I will maybe share that with Yasmin and she can pass it on if that's okay. But yeah, I'll hand back to Yasmin. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Finn. Thanks for sharing your guidance with us. I hope everyone took something away from that. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, we've got a question from John to Finn. So, how do businesses deal with gender fluid people?
So I guess it depends what you specifically mean by that, but generally no differently to anyone else. If someone is gender fluid and they want you to use gender neutral pronouns, they will probably tell you that. So you would just use, I think I always try and tell people, be led by the person. So if this is something that someone's going through, oftentimes they will tell you, especially if they are gender fluid, because there's just not a lot of awareness of gender fluidity and outside of the gender binary. There's not a lot of awareness about identities like that. So yeah, just be led by the person, really. Okay,
great. Thanks, Finn. Has anyone got any last minute questions? Just pop them in the box. But I'd just like to say thank you to both of our speakers. We really appreciate you taking out the time to come and speak to us today. If anyone does have any more questions for Daryl or Finn, I will share their contact details on the follow-up email. Just before we finish, I'm just going to read out an event that I think you would all benefit from as a HR professional. So this week we have our employment launch event on Friday 9 till 10:30. So annually we produce an employment report in partnership with Hewett Recruitment and EBC Group. This report allows businesses to benchmark salaries and benefits they offer. This report this time focuses on how businesses have been affected by COVID-19 and the significant employment and recruitment challenges they face. It is a free event for members and non-members, but if you'd like to join that, I will send out a booking link on the follow-up email too. But that's it from me. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Hewett Recruitment, and Ben for joining us and continuing to help us with these events. But I hope you've all enjoyed today's session and taken something away from that. I will be following up shortly, but I hope you all have a lovely afternoon and take care. See you soon. Bye.